monotheism, therefore, is seen as conflictual. This idea of Moses triggering the whole process by rejecting Egypt and its gods and then persecuting the Philistines in order to inaugurate the story of the first Israeli occupation, if you like. The story is still going on, still conflictual. Monotheism is still at it on this argument. And you can see the point. It is the case that the Romans, when they invaded neighbouring countries, didn't really do so for religious reasons in order to get the Gauls to start worshipping Zeus and Demeter and Pluto. Instead, it was secular conquest that was at stake. This idea of monotheism as intrinsically conflictual also seems to hinge, in terms of the relationships between the monotheisms, on one of the most pregnant and interesting of biblical stories, which is the gulf between Isaac and Ishmael. And right-wing evangelical American Christians very often focus on the Genesis image of Ishmael as a kind of indication of everything that's wrong with the Arab world and the Islamic world today. Ishmael, according to their reading of the story, is cast out. He's not the heir to the promise. He is rejected, thrown out with his mother into the wilderness. He is of half-Gentile origin, and he is not the heir. And his hand will be against all men. Ishmael constructed by the authors of this particular part of the book of Genesis as somebody who is going to cause trouble for the people who alone have God's true message. From the point of view of Islam, that story is read differently. And to understand the whole story of Islam's conceptual engagement with violence, you have to understand the importance of these archetypes, these first stories in Scripture. The biblical account is usually read as the parting of the ways. And from a Christian perspective, there's the Judeo-Christian stream, which comes from Isaac, and Jacob, and the heirs to the promise, and all of the heroes of the Old Testament, culminating in Jesus himself. And then there is the withered branch, Ishmael, who goes off into the desert and represents as a kind of image for everything that is opposed to God's plan. In the context of Islam, although the Quran clearly is in, one might say, in continuity with key themes of the biblical story, in some very key respects it actually disagrees and does something new, and the actual historical precedent for that is often very difficult, if not impossible, to discern. In the case of the Isaac-Ishmael archetype, this apparent justification of an eternal conflict between the two branches of monotheism, we find that in the Quranic account, both of them seem to be the object of a sacrifice, and both of them seem to be heirs to the promise. Ishmael, of course, is the older son. And what does his name mean? His name means God heard. He's cast out into the desert, but which desert? According to the Islamic memory, he ends up in the valley that eventually becomes the city of Mecca. So when Muslims go for the culminating rite of their life cycle, the pilgrimage, the Hajj in Mecca, the fifth obligation, the fifth pillar of Islam, they are affirming the fact that it wasn't a withered branch that was sent out, apparently unjustly, into the desert, but that story too has a culmination. That culmination is part of God's bigger plan that transcends and breaks the bounds of the biblical story, the bigger picture of monotheism, which shows the two branches, very different, running in different channels, different valleys if you like, but both being stories for God. Abraham got his face on the cover of Time magazine 4 or 5 years ago. And the whole emphasis in that issue was, can there ever be peace in the Middle East if Ishmael and Isaac are always at odds? What they didn't mention was that the majoritarian story in the Middle East now, which is the Arab Islamic story, holds that Isaac and Ishmael are not intrinsically at odds. They are brothers, they're reconciled, they bury their father together. That's even in the book of Genesis. There's a hint there that the story can end in reconciliation. And both are monotheistic stories for God. That fact, that fundamental, original story, archetype in the Muslim imagination is very important. For the Crusaders, when they went to liberate Jerusalem from the Saracen, there was no value in Ishmael. And we don't know exactly what the word Saracen means, but it might have something to do with the fact that they claimed incorrectly to be the descendants of Sarah, but of course they were lying. They were from Hajar, the bondsmaid. But the Islamic reciprocation of that can never be based on a demonizing, a delegitimizing of the story of the other. Islam has serious issues with the historic evolution of Judaism and Christianity, but it does not for a moment deny the legitimacy of the founding impulse. And that sets up a disequilibrium, which ultimately, I think, is one of the reasons why you get in this body count sort of league table of miscreancy, that the Muslims by and large score much better than do certainly Western European Christians. The Orthodox record is somewhat different. So that's the archetype, but Islam in its understanding of its relationship to the other doesn't just go back as far as Abraham. Abraham, in the Muslim imagination and memory, founds the Kaaba. That's the basis of the Hajj, which is the great drawing together of the nations. But the story goes back further, before the beginning of history. And there's a striking passage in the Quran which seems to indicate a kind of human assembly and togetherness before we were all allocated to our various bodies in this world. It's a prologue in heaven. And it just comes up once in the Quran. It's Surah 7, verse 172. And it says, "And remember when thy Lord brought forth from the children of Adam their descendants, and made them testify of themselves, Am I not your Lord? Yes, they said, we testify. That was lest you should say on the day of resurrection, of this we were unaware." And that's a crux in Islamic theology. The idea is humanity originally, naturally, primordially in a condition of unity. Everybody together, before there were Muslims, Jews, Christians, Zoroastrians, anything, everybody standing equally before God, and everybody bearing witness to the unity and the other qualities of the divine. That's the other default with which traditional Muslim theologians have viewed the religious other. The fact that, however messed up their theology might be today, nonetheless at root, these are people who were, as we were, equally in the presence of God. And this ties into the Islamic rejection of the idea of original sin. There is, properly speaking, no unregenerate humanity. If you have to make war against another community, you're not doing so because they are infrahuman. You're doing so because they've forgotten what it truly means to be human. Now, the founding moment and the founding mood of the specifically Islamic form of religion, after the prologue in heaven, after Abraham, after Jesus, 7th century Arabia, is a story which involves an element of heroism and the warrior's vocation. And this sometimes is set up as a kind of opposition with the Gospels. Just as the Gospels were historically very often set up as an opposition to the bad old days of the Old Testament, a leading theme of traditional anti-Semitism, so too the Gospels are often set up as in opposition to the Islamic story, the seerah, the biography of the Prophet. And that again is a common polemical theme. In fact, if you look at it, you will find that the understanding of the situation of those two communities was incommensurable. The Prophet is in Medina, his community have been persecuted, some of them have been killed, they've been outcast, they are threatened with annihilation by the armies of the idolaters coming from Mecca. That's a different context to the situation of primal Christianity, which is living in the Pax Romana, a very nasty, brutal empire, but nonetheless the people were in a state of some kind of stability. All kinds of civil wars emerging, Jewish zealot movements all over the place, hundreds, thousands of people being crucified for voicing opposition to Rome, but still a very different kind of context to that of Arabia. Because resistance in 7th century Arabia could conceivably succeed. Resistance against the might of the Roman Imperium, as all of the rebels from